achieve higher and higher levels of realism in painting, which they roughly did about 400 years ago. They achieved photorealism.
Right.
And from that point, art decided, okay, well, instead of going for the external representation of objects, let's go more for the internal representation of how these objects make us feel. And we got things like, modernism, impressionism, constructivism, things like that. So I think games are kind of getting to the point where we can almost put things on the screen that are plenty real enough, to be realistic. And now we're starting to go into realms of artistic expression, a little bit less real stylized.
But if we had the capacity to make truly realistic characters in Spore, do you think that would be more compelling? I mean, part of this is because the computer power isn't there for completely realistic-looking characters, right? If you had it, would you want to make those kind of characters? Do you think you'd stay with?
I would not for a game like this, because a game like this, I really want the players to own the characters. And I think by going to a certain level of abstraction, you're basically letting the player fill in the blanks in their imagination to some degree. It also makes the tools a little bit easier to use. If you were down to like seeing, the stubble on their face, it's incredibly distracting as an author in terms of what you're building. Right. And all of a sudden the level of editing just becomes tremendously more burdensome. So in some sense, I think and also if you look at just kind of character design across, fiction, you kind of have the gamut from things like, Geiger and Aliens all the way to Pixar, which is kind of cute and cartoony, oversaturated colors. And I think, in fact, what we really want is give the players that palette. Not that everything you have to make is realistic, but in fact, they could make Pokemon or things like that, or Disney.
I read an article in Esquire last summer. I think it was written by Chuck Klosterman. He was talking about. He said there's never actually been a work of criticism written about a video game that stands up based on its artistic principles. That all video games or computer games are to this day still basically reviewed like new flat screen televisions.
Yeah.
It's sort of a little bit, better here, better here. And I'm wondering, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that there is yet a sort of a body of critical standards that allows us to artistically discriminate between video games, or that we're not there yet and it's going to take a while to get there?
Well, I think as designers, we don't have a developed language for talking about the craft of our art form, which puts a double burden on a journalist trying to cover it or a critic.
Right.
At the same time, this is inherently an art form that you have to kind of look at from the inside out rather than the outside in. When everybody's going to see the same version of Star Wars, it's pretty easy for the critic to kind of understand that they're having the same experience sitting in the theater that every other patron is. Whereas in a game, every player is going to drive it into a totally unique space and have a totally different experience. Basically, in some sense, play their own story.
Right.
So it's much harder. I think you kind of
define a set of standards for that kind of experience.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
so individualistic.
Right. At the same time, it's a dramatic narrative, that's unique to every player.
Right.
So it has aspects of architecture, product design, depends on the time of day you were playing, who you were playing with. Was it a social game you were playing with friends?
Right.
Were you being very creative and making cool things in it? So it's going to be quite a while, I think, before we have, kind of that language for talking about the medium. The same problem is actually what schools are facing, because a lot of students are wanting to come in learning how to design